A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
With all the major developments and geopolitical tensions now around the world, we might be wondering what happens in the worst case scenarios. What happens if Australia is again at war? And how does the Christian and the church prepare hearts for war? Well, Stephen McAlpine, the award-winning Christian author, pastor and national consultant for churches and Christian schools, been thinking through the issues. He's back with us. Hey, Stephen, welcome back to 2020.
It's good to be with you, Neil, even though these are trying times.
These are trying times. In fact, in your latest article that's up on your website, Stephen, and I'll point listeners to it a little bit later on, you say we haven't been as interested in war as war has been interested in us. What do you mean by that?
Well, that's saying you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And we spun that to the culture war for a generation or so, that the culture war might be interested in you. But when actual war comes along, it sweeps some of those sociological things aside, I think, and there is no way that war does not come to bear on our lives, whether we want it to or not. And most people, I'm hoping, don't want war, but at some stage you have to say, where is the point where the people opposed to us don't want war? There's always two sides to that, and that's the question we have to face in every generation, and our generation hasn't had to face that in its own backyard for a while.
Not for a while. And interestingly, in your article you say too that if we are for real at war and bodies and lives are on the line and maybe even incoming missiles here in Australia, let's just say we were talking worst case scenario, but we might be longing for the days when all we were doing was fighting the culture war. There's a big difference.
Yeah, though the interesting thing is that the left position on the culture war takes a much more a myopic view of where the Middle East situation is. And part of the culture war has been to say that Israel bad, everyone else good, or at least not as bad as they could be. But you have to realise that the culture war is going to split Australia's opinion on actual war down the middle on these issues. If not down the middle, there are two very opposing sides. And I think that's what's going to happen. But as for war, I was up in Darwin the other week and was going for a run near the beach, and there were the 80-year-old and a bit more gun turret areas from when Japan bombed Australia. And that seems like a different universe, never mind a different century in that sense.
Our political leaders have been making comment around the developments on the weekend, the US bombing those sites of the uranium enrichment in Iran. And the commentariat is really now thinking, what are the things that are coming from here? I wonder if you've got any thoughts briefly around the way that Australia approaches the idea of war. Our political leaders and the statements they're making about these things, treading a very fine line, which you might hope they do diplomatically, but any thoughts here around some of the developments and where our political leaders might be saying we're at?
Yeah, I think that Australians don't want to be jingoistic about war. If you've watched Gallipoli, the movie, you'll know what that leads to. We don't want that kind of war. We don't want any war, of course, but the world is heading that way because there are superpowers, and Australia is not a superpower. So our leaders are very softly. They're also quite softly in how they have to deal with different constituencies that they have, which would be opposed to their position on these bombings. And so I think that's part of the problem. But if you have read anything in the past, Andrew Hastie has written on these things. He's the Shadow Home Affairs Minister, he used to be the Shadow Defence Minister, and he was in the SAS. No one is particularly jingoistic about war in Australia, but some do see it as something that is going to be necessary because it will come your way anyway.
In your article, you say wars spread when empires grow and seek to expand, whether in terms of territory or ideology. The ideology that different sides of the political spectrum might choose to hold to, that becomes very important, doesn't it, when there is a true, real threat of war?
Yeah, and one of the things you'd want to say about the ideology in Australia is generally it's left and right of a certain line. And that certain line is, I don't think most people realise how different the ideologies in, say, Iran are actually to Australia. Negotiation and diplomacy aren't really part of their broader picture. And that's just, that's off their own words. So Australia has to be very careful that it isn't trying to it's apples and oranges when it comes to how we go forward with these things. If you've got an enemy of certain states that's implacable, diplomacy doesn't work. And Australia's now in this funny mix of people on the left saying that if it's America, if it's Israel, it's wrong. And I don't quite get that, given that their framework in the left in Australia is much more aligned to how America and Israel lives its life. That isn't to say that both America and Israel do not do things that are wrong, but I wouldn't compare them to Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, or Assad, or the Iranian Empire, which is propping them all up. It feels like there's two very different worldviews clashing there.
Different worldviews, and even, as you say, a polarisation of people in Australia. And if you were going to war for real, you don't want polarisation, do you? You want everyone to be united around a common goal, a common way of thinking about what is free and what is worth fighting for. Where do you think we're at in Australia so far as this polarisation and people on different levels of the spectrum?
Well, since the Vietnam War and the disaster that was for a lot of Australians, I don't think we've ever had a common mind. And don't forget the sexual revolution of the 60s, the anti-war movement, the progressive framework. And I think the way Australia went in with America into Vietnam soured Australia's relationship to how we move forward. So we've seen ourselves as the kind of people who will go and help East Timor, for example, and we put boots on the ground in different places like Iraq. But Australia is very reluctant to go down that path. And I think things have changed in Australia, that there is no common vision of what a good society looks like. Australia has an interesting relationship to war, given it has gone into war and regretted it since the 60s. And there's been a full push against some of the positions we hold. So there isn't a united Australia about what the common good is. And that's always going to push us in different directions. So we don't have a common way to rally people around, and we'd want to be careful about that anyway. We don't want to get into warmongering.
So with all of the speculation that we might have, you might even be making wild predictions about what might happen. We're feeling so far removed from the conflicts that are around the world, but you're in a way of thinking, Stephen McAlpine, that Australians need to actually think very carefully here, because the likelihood of real war coming is really upon us.
Yes, it is. I think we are in a situation where the empires have grown to such an extent and have competing interests and conflicting interests. So war inevitably happens. There's no reason, just because we're a modern Western nation or modern Western nations, that war will not sweep us away or sweep us up. And I think as Christians, you have to think about, what does that mean? And I wonder if churches have prepared their people to think about what a time of conflict would look like for the church, and what that might mean to still trust Jesus in the midst of it. If you're not a Christian in this setting, I think it would be a lot more discombobulating than being a Christian.
A lot of churches are looking at the things that are developing in the Middle East, and they are bringing their own biblical commentary around the end times and the things that look like they fit with end-time biblical prophecy. And, of course, famous scripture from Matthew 24, you'll hear of wars and rumours of wars, but see to it that you're not alarmed. See, such things must happen, but the end is still to come. How do you think we're interpreting verses like that in light of real-world events?
Well, I think as Westerners, we often look at the Bible and say that passage may have had something to do with Israel or the time of Jerusalem in Jesus' day, but it's really about us. And I think that's part of our problem. Jesus said the time is not end is not yet. Yet we read those wars and rumours of wars as if they are. Yet it would seem that we should take Jesus at his word. The disciples were being told by Jesus about the destruction of the temple. And for them, that just destroyed all of their hopes and dreams. And they thought, Jesus must bring the kingdom in then. But he said no. So somehow Jesus pushes things back and doesn't gratify our curiosities about when the end will be. And every major war there's a Christian group somewhere that says this is the one, and it hasn't been yet.
And so if we're preparing ourselves for the one that may well be on the horizon now, are there a lot of questions you think that Christians ask when it comes to wartime? Am I a pacifist? Am I going to commit to being on the front line to defend my nation because I have a wonderful certain sense of nationhood and I'm a proud citizen? These sorts of questions, do you think the Bible has really great insight into wisdom around how you prepare for those sorts of issues?
Well, it's interesting that the subsequent generations from the New Testament of Christians had to grapple with the whole idea of is there something called a just war? Is there a just reason to go to war? And there were pacifists then, and there were people who said there was a just reason to go to war. And you have to navigate that with what are the just reasons. Now, Christians also need to realise that they don't have all the intel on everything. And so what we have to grapple with is more to the point, as C.S. Lewis would have said, it puts death front and centre in your life, that war itself is destruction and death are the two issues up front. And if churches haven't equipped their people for what destruction and death might be like, or how Jesus is our hope in the midst of that, we're not serving our church as well. It can't be simply that we say, Jesus is here to give you a good life and a hall pass from any trouble. It must be able to equip us for difficult times as well as good times.
Is what is being preached from the pulpit and in conversations like we're having today, is this the sort of preparation that is necessary? Because as you really well, I think, articulate, perhaps Christians in Australia are not ready to have the good life taken away. We might be thinking that the good life can be taken away for many reasons, but war might not be one of them. But that actually becomes a possibility as we're having a conversation like this.
Well, that's right. It's not as if suddenly everything was the good life. Disease, death, accidents, pandemics have taken the good life away all the time, and war has just been dialed back a little bit. But it was always there in history and is there again today. And I think it's grappling with the fact that our hope is not in this age, and that our hope is when Jesus, the Prince of Peace, comes, that we will see peace. Now, that doesn't mean we sit in an enclave and not worry about anything else or even take notice of anything else. But it is to say that our hope is in a different place, and we will see full justice restored when Jesus returns. And also that's when the true good life begins. And perhaps what it's done to us as Christians is just turn up the heat a little bit on our expectations. What do I think God owes me? Well, he doesn't owe us peace in this age yet. I think we're having to grapple with that.
Stephen, if war is really on our doorstep, the prayer that we have when we're having a quiet time and a time of devotion and thinking of the things that are important to pray for, what are your thoughts around praying for our leaders, whether we like them or not?
Well, a couple of things. Pray for them privately as you should. Even if you think they're your political enemy, Jesus would say pray for them. But I also think that churches should pray for their leaders more regularly. And I'm in a tradition where that happens most weeks. But we should be praying about our leaders, whether we agree with them or not, because it's a difficult job. I wouldn't want to be, it's like sitting in the bleachers telling the baseball player who's earning $20 million how to play the game. You're not playing it. And I think we need to pray for our leaders in the midst of it, that they'll make just decisions based on good information, and that they'll be able to wear the opprobrium of which side disagrees with them. I think that's what we've had to do, and commit them to God.
Steve, what does this mean for the mission of the church? I mean, we interpret that in all sorts of different ways. Sometimes we think of that as the Great Commission. Sometimes we think there's a cultural commission that goes along with what we are as Christian believers and having dominion. Does war necessarily disrupt, or has it got the biggest risk that it may disrupt our mission? And what about our motivations that they might be now, how they might change if there's war? Any thoughts around the mission of the church?
Well, in Matthew 24, Jesus says, here there'll be wars and rumours of wars, there'll be kingdoms rise, kingdoms fall, earthquakes, there'll be false prophets leading everyone astray. But then says this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world. So he doesn't say when those things are set aside and all the conditions are perfect and lined up, we'll be able to get the gospel message out. You're going to find that people will ask deeper questions in the midst of war times. They're going to ask questions about what's the meaning and purpose of life, just like they did in the pandemic. And I don't think it will stop this, what's so-called quiet revival of people wanting something more than what the world has to offer. So I don't think it's going to stop that at some level.
Is it a motivating thing, or is it something more disturbing if we're thinking apocalyptically now? I mean, does this add to the anxiety of our children, our teenagers, our young people? The way that we think of the way God is leading history. What are your thoughts around the dangers, or even the way that we might even overemphasize some points?
Well, the problem we have culturally is that when Jesus says you'll hear of wars and rumours of wars, it's in your face instantly because of our social medias. We didn't have war 6 or so years ago, and there wasn't a pandemic, but the level of anxiety in our culture was huge. There's more going on than just difficult times. There's something about the way we are in terms of looking for meaning and purpose and direction in the West. War does give you direction. There's certainly that. It clears your head a little bit for good or ill. But I think what we'd need to say is people are anxious enough as it is. Dialing down the talk of war won't take that anxiety away because war is interested in us. But we do need to say we need to redirect people towards a better hope. Apocalyptic's a good word because it simply means to reveal. And so the pandemic revealed something about us, and war will reveal something about us. That does not mean that the last apocalypse day will be ushered in on the basis of this war that's coming, whatever it is, but it does mean that it will reveal something about us, and I think that's critical.
And you were reflecting in your article on some perspectives on death and reflecting on C.S. Lewis and some thoughts that listeners might even like to go to their bookshelf and drag that C.S. Lewis book down if it's one of those that talks about living and dying and what's really valuable. Is the prospect of war something that's likely to diminish our faith, or ought it to be something that actually causes our faith to grow and grow strong because we have this hope in Christ?
Well, it's interesting that C.S. Lewis says war will make you think about death, as it should, but it won't create more deaths because 100% of us will die. But he also wrote an earlier sermon where he was speaking about if you're in university doing a literature degree, keep doing it. War shouldn't stop us doing the things we're doing because we should still go out and do those things because that's what it means to be a Christian, to live in any time. You go out and do the things whether the times are for you or against you. And I think that gives us a lot of confidence as Christians. I do think too that because we don't think about death a lot as Christians, it was instructive that the early graveyards were in churchyards so that as you walked to church, you remembered that death was part of the process. We don't do that now. And so we need to think about how we speak, not just about war and life, but also how we speak about death. And C.S. Lewis was very good at saying, live a full life now, but know that death comes.
We might be in prayer for our own national leaders as these things heat up around the world. And I'd like to point listeners to one of your latest articles, Stephen McAlpine, War, Actual War is Back. Are we ready? And for listeners, no doubt they'll be able to access that article and read a few more things in depth. We've touched on a few issues out of that in our conversation today, but you'll be able to find that article at stephenmcalpine.com. stephenmcalpine.com. Stephen is an award-winning Christian author, pastor, and national consultant for churches and Christian schools. And you might be thinking, well, I've never heard anyone yet talking about the fact that we might be going to war, you might like to give that article a little read and make your own assessment. Stephen McAlpine, thanks so much for sharing your insights with us once again today on 2020.
Oh, it's been great to be with you. I know hopefully we'll be around in 2 weeks' time to do it again.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.